everybody. Thank you so much. This is a great turnout. My name is Dr. Evan Reepsum. I am the current director of the MLA program. And maybe about a year ago, I spoke to Jennifer and Broadmoor Library about restarting the Showcase Lecture Series. This was a series that had been established and then had stopped as it was transitioned between directorships. And so Jennifer welcomed us back. It's been wonderful and encouraging. And so in the spring, we had a series of professors deliver presentations on their research. And this fall is the first time that graduate students are doing their presentations on their research. And so really excited for you all to hear this. Last week, Noah had presented. This week, Abigail is presenting, and next week, Letitia is presenting. And so I know I'm eager. I know that some of the information about that being presented tonight, but I'm excited to learn with all of you. If any of you are interested, one of the reasons why we're doing this is to try to help develop, partnerships and relationships between community members and the university to make sure we're working together and supporting each other. So if any of you are interested in learning more about the MLA program, I have information with me. You can call and see me. Otherwise, you can sit back and enjoy the presentation that Abigail's worked really hard on. Oh wait, one more thing. I have a bio for Abigail. Abigail Boykin is a Shreveport native currently enrolled in Louisiana State University's Master of Liberal Arts program. She received her bachelor's degree in history from the same institution and currently works as a research assistant for Dr. Gary Joyner in the LSUS History and Social Sciences Department. Her area of study includes historical ethnocultural development in the American South with an emphasis on the Texas-Louisiana waterways. Please join me in welcoming Abigail.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out to this talk. I know it's right after work, so I really appreciate it. Tonight we are going to be discussing a true gem of Northwest Louisiana culture, the Adecenyo dialect of Spanish. This presentation is part of a much larger project on the historical development of Adecenyo in Northwest Louisiana and its current state today. To begin, I'd like to give some perspective on language in the United States. As you probably know, last March our government decided to make English the nation's official language. Some people were shocked to learn that English wasn't already our official language, given how prevalent it is in American culture. Yet when we take a look at how the United States came to be, we see a complex tapestry of language and culture that stretches from colonial times to the present day. We see French spoken in North Maine, Navajo in the Southwest, and Spanish dominates places such as Puerto Rico that are integral to our nation. Even isolated communities like the Amish and Mennonites have their own Germanic dialects that they use every single day. In our own state of Louisiana, we have a rich linguistic heritage that sadly is slipping away. Many of us are familiar with Cajun people in the southern part of the state. You might even be related to some. Their culture and French language has been heavily researched in academia and widely celebrated across Louisiana. In this map, you can see that Cajuns are represented by a dark army green. I'd like you to turn your attention as well to something a little different. You'll see that there's some pink spots on this map. It's a little hard to see in this light. Those pink spots, there should be 3 of them, represent the last bastions of the Spanish language in Louisiana. Adecenyo, Brule, and Isleño. These 3 dialects are the sum total of Louisiana's Spanish language heritage. All 3 are in rough shape today. Both Adecenyo and Brule are dormant, meaning that no known fluent speakers currently exist, while Isleño is kept alive only by a handful of elders in St. Bernard Parish. Thank you. Adecenyo is particularly unique among the 3, as it developed independently and has strong ties to indigenous populations today, whereas Isleño and Brule descended from Canary Islander populations. The story of Adecenyo, northwestern Louisiana's one and only native dialect of Spanish, goes back hundreds of years and passes through countless hands. It's a story of resilience and creativity, of people from different cultures and backgrounds building a language of their own in order to survive. It begins, oddly enough, with the Aztecs. The Spanish invasion of the Mexica, or Aztec, Empire in the 1500s led to the establishment of a new colonial order. Since Nahuatl was the lingua franca of the Mexica, It had an immense presence in the area prior to Spanish arrival. A combination of Spanish and Nahuatl functioned as a trade language between Spanish colonists and indigenous populations. Colonists living in the province of Coahuila and in west central Texas were in regular contact with Nahuatl speakers and incorporated various terms into their everyday language. Here I have some examples of Nahuatl words that persisted in Adecenyo up until the 21st century. You'll note that some of these terms describe animals, plants, and things that the Spaniards didn't have access to back in Spain. As a result, they have words like calotes, meaning sweet potatoes, or pichicuetes, water moccasins. You may have seen a pichicuete lately, I have no idea. However, some Nahuatl terms completely replaced standard Spanish items, such as the verb quali, which means to like. Typically, Spanish speakers use gustar, and having a Nahuatl verb take the place of this common term is a testament to the prolonged interaction between Spanish and indigenous populations. I'm off on my clicker, I apologize. Though Nahuatl-speaking populations themselves did not contribute to the ethnic ancestry of the Adecenos, the Spanish colonists of Coahuila and west central Texas did. You see, Spain saw little value in Texas during the colonial era. It was occupied by several indigenous populations, including nomadic and warlike tribes such as the Comanche, Apache, and Karankawa, which made settling rather dangerous. Precious resources such as silver and gold, which were abundant further south in places like Mexico and Bolivia, were scarce in Texas. And worst of all, the easternmost portion of the province led into the thick pine forests of northwestern Louisiana, which was controlled by the French. The Spanish decided to treat Texas as a strategic buffer zone against French encroachment. They established a short-lived mission among the native Adai people at modern-day Robeline, Louisiana. The mission, called San Miguel de los Linares de los Ideas, lasted a pathetic 2 years before the French eventually captured it, in 1719. The missionaries, soldiers, and civilians that occupied it retreated back west. A second attempt at creating a combination mission fort proved successful, and impoverished conscripts and peasants from Coahuila and west central Texas were made to trek north along El Camino Real, an immense road stretching from Mexico City all the way to our very own village of Natchitoches. You can see it on this map behind me as the easternmost tangle of red lines. That's kind of off there. And actually, if you head down to Natchitoches right now and walk along that brick paved road, the main road that they have there, you look out across the water and you keep going, you will find a giant pink granite slab telling you that you've reached the end of El Camino Real. So, pretty cool thing to check out. It was these Spanish soldiers and civilians who brought their rural, Nahuatl-influenced variety of Spanish to northwest Louisiana. The mission fort they occupied was named Nuestra Senora del Pilar de los Ideas, and historians would later dub them and their descendants as Adecenos. The Adecenyo dialect actually retains many of the same words used by these colonial Spaniards. Unlike other Spanish dialects which shifted to different terms over time, the Adecenyo dialect remained isolated from other varieties of Spanish and kept using the same words from colonial times. To illustrate how odd these words are, I would like to compare the word calzones and pantalones. You and I would typically call these garments pants, right? Well, what if you came across someone who only referred to them as breeches? It'd be a bit different, right? So this is the sort of difference that we're seeing in the archaic terms that have been kept versus what the rest of the Hispanic world is saying. When Spaniards established their new mission fort at Los Ideas, they found themselves at the center of a multi-ethnic world. Native tribes, both those who were from northwest Louisiana and those who were just passing through, spoke a variety of languages. They traded with both the Spanish and the nearby French at Natchitoches, supplying furs and pelts in exchange for manufactured goods like fabrics. This form of commerce was termed the Indian trade, and both France and Spain wanted monopoly over it. Many indigenous groups in the area were skilled in warfare and highly mobile, meaning that allegiance to one colonial power over the other could result in conflict. As such, both the Spanish and the French sought to appease native groups with gifts and goods to keep them, at the very least, neutral. The Caddo-speaking tribes such as the Adai, Yatasi, Natchitoches, and Caddo-Hidacho were prominent in the area. The Caddo-Hidacho in particular boasted that they had never shed European blood and had no intention to ever do so. peace held in the region, and the colonists of Los Ideas actually began to break Spanish law by trading with the French at Natchitoches. Living in such a far-flung region of New Spain made these Spaniards more amicable toward their French and native neighbors, and a booming economy of illegally traded items emerged despite the protest of Spanish authorities in Mexico City. A darker aspect to this trade came in the form of slavery. Though the Spanish crown officially outlawed the enslavement of indigenous peoples in 1672, the practice continued through a variety of legal loopholes. Conflicts with native tribes in Texas and northern Mexico, specifically with the Apache, led Spaniards to kill native men in combat and take women and children as captives. These captives, who existed under the loosely defined umbrella of prisoner, were often made to function as servants in Spanish households. Some were illegally carried off to be traded in the Texas-Louisiana borderlands. By 1740, the majority of native slaves in Natchitoches were Lipan Apache, and over 2/3 of all enslaved natives in French-controlled Louisiana were female. These Lipan Apache women became concubines or wives of European men, including those active in the Indian trade. Addisenios also intermarried with these women, making Lipan Apache one of the prominent branches of Addiseno ancestry. Despite being fluent speakers of Lipan Apache, these women did not pass their language on to their children. Fight with this thing today, y'all. This detail may not seem earth-shaking, but in the context of linguistics, women were actually the primary drivers of language change in most cultures across the world. Women are typically in close contact with their children from a young age and shape their language development more so than men do. To oversimplify, language is passed from mother to child. Why then do we find no clear Lipan Apache influence on the Addiseno dialect, if the women were the mothers of Addiseno children? The answer lies in power and community. Lipan Apache women were taken from their communities and enslaved by cultures completely alien to them. They were isolated from a larger Apache community and found themselves occupying one of the lowest possible social tiers on the frontier. Learning European languages such as French and Spanish was a necessity, not a choice, and allowed Lipan Apache women to navigate their new circumstances. Sorry, not a choice, and allowed, yes, okay, that was right. Okay, sorry. John Sibley, Indian agent of Natchitoches, reported that these women continued to speak a language peculiar to themselves, and at times used gestures and signs to assist in communication. They did not pass down Lipan Apache to their children because they had no practical reason to do so, and no larger Lipan Apache community to connect with. The children of Addisenios and Lipan Apache women therefore grew up speaking Addiseno Spanish. In 1763, Spain acquired Louisiana from France. You may think to yourself, well, that works out right. Now the Addisenios can live and trade alongside the French, since both Texas and Louisiana are owned by Spain. But this wasn't the case. Instead, Spain eventually saw no further need for a mission fort along the former border and ordered Addisenios to head towards San Antonio in 1773. The ensuing journey deserves an entire presentation of its own and is very complex, so forgive me for simplifying it as this. The Addisenios reluctantly left Los Ideas, with some families refusing to leave and instead taking refuge amongst native populations in the area. Those who made the trek to San Antonio found they absolutely hated it, and they petitioned to settle elsewhere. The result was an establishment of a settlement called Bucareli, which also ended up being horrible, and the weary Addisenios defied Spanish orders and returned back to East Texas and West Louisiana. They settled from Nacogdoches, which is in modern Texas, west of the Sabine River, to Spanish Lake, east of the Sabine River. Despite direct orders from Spanish authorities not to settle closer than 100 leagues from Natchitoches, the Addisenios went where they pleased. Prolonged exposure to Louisiana French, both before and after the removal of Addisenios, resulted in French words being absorbed into the dialect. You may notice that some of these words are spelled differently from their Louisiana French counterparts. For example, the Addiseno word pasaportu derives from the Louisiana French word passepartout, which means a cross-cut saw. The Addisenios adapted these Louisiana French words to fit their own standards of pronunciation in Spanish. It's also speculated that Addisenios used existing Spanish words to imitate French words. For example, the French word tiburon typically means shark, but in Abyssinian Spanish it means bullfrog. So you might be wondering, why are they using the word shark here? Dr. Hiram F. Gregory believes this may have occurred as an attempt to reproduce the Louisiana French word wawaron, which means a bullfrog. Both words are 3 syllables and both end with the same sounds. If this is true, it demonstrates a high degree of adaptation and creativity among Abyssinian speakers. One last linguistic group contributed to the early formation of the Abyssinian dialect. In the late 1600s, Spanish authorities urged tribes west of the Mississippi River to settle in Louisiana, including the northwestern region. Spanish reasoning was twofold. If tribes moved further into Spanish territory, they wouldn't be so easily swayed by encroaching English forces in West Florida. And the tribes would form smaller populations as they migrated that would be easier to control. One such tribe was the Choctaw. They're native to modern-day Mississippi, our neighbors, and spoke a language also called Choctaw. As bands pushed westward into Louisiana at the Spaniards' invitation, they brought with them another unique language, Mobilian trade language. Tribes overlapping with the Choctaw homeland and beyond spoke this trade pidgin to one another for economic and social reasons. Being a pidgin, Mobilian wasn't a fully formed language, and it was never the first language of anyone. It came in handy when dealing with different tribes who spoke different tongues, and especially when the Europeans came on the scene. Both Choctaw and Mobilian trade language are closely related. They both belong to the Muskogean language family and therefore have a lot of overlap. It's difficult sometimes for us to tell if a word is Mobilian or if a word is Choctaw, because oftentimes the same word exists for both. We've seen how a rural Spanish dialect evolved to incorporate Louisiana French, Choctaw, and Mobilian influences as the ethnic makeup of the Abyssinians themselves grew more complex. Now we will take a look at how this complex language held its own for generations in northwest Louisiana. In the year 1800, Spain quietly returned Louisiana to France. This transfer was short-lived as in 1804, France decided to sell it to the United States, marking the beginning of a new era. Waves of Anglo-Americans entered Louisiana, including the northwestern portion. The French Creoles of Natchitoches bristled at the newcomers, but tribes such as the Caddo-Hadacho were quick to make friends with the Americans. Along with the shift in leadership came a shift in worldview. The multi-ethnic inhabitants of the Louisiana-Texas borderlands found that both their indigenous and Spanish heritage was frowned upon. And as the years wore on, the Abyssinians were reduced to the incorrect label of Mexican. Pressure from American settlers and more rigid concepts of race led Abyssinians to withdraw from the outside world, and instead embrace isolation in their small rural communities. During the early decades of the 1800s, conflict erupted in Texas. Beginning in 1810, the Mexican War for Independence caused many Abyssinians living west of the Sabine River to take refuge with their neighbors to the east. When the dust settled in 1821, over a decade later, the newly independent Mexican government invited the Abyssinians back to their former homes. Many were thrilled to return to Nacogdoches and other Texan settlements. However, an increasing Anglo-American pressure in Texas tipped the scales in favor of American interests that culminated in the Texas Revolution of 1835. Once again thrown into an uncertain political climate, Abyssinians had to grapple with the complex intersections of ethnic, national, and cultural identity. In 1838, a mestizo named Vicente Cordova led a rebellion against the newly formed Texan Republic that ended in failure. Some of the Texas revolutionaries fled into the Louisiana borderlands, becoming incorporated into the Abyssinian population. These instances of Spanish-speaking populations coming in contact with Abyssinian communities shows how the Spanish language was reinforced during the early 1800s. Not only were these Spanish speakers living closely with Abyssinians, they also brought with them dialects similar to the Abyssinians themselves. In the case of the people from Nacogdoches, it was literally the same dialect that they were bringing back and reinforcing. Even today, those descended from Abyssinians reflect fondly on their native and Spanish roots. Mr. Lonnie Martinez, in a published 1983 interview, muses on his ancestry. Quote, "Yeah, we had some good old Spanish country gentlemen in here, Spanish and Indian. They lived a righteous life, raised big families, end quote. Yet having visible mixed ancestry and a non-English first language came with its own slew of struggles in the American era. Endogamy, or the practice of marrying within a specific community, kept Addisonio alive for a time. Customs and foodways from various indigenous backgrounds, such as Choctaw, survived even in a sea of Anglo-American presence. Yet while isolation served to protect the Addisonios from culture loss and the craze of Indian removal, it also spoke to a harsh reality experienced by indigenous peoples across the state. Native Americans, including those of mixed ancestry, faced major obstacles to education, representation, and basic rights. They wouldn't receive citizenship to the United States until 1924, when a federal law formally recognized all U.S.-born natives as citizens. As a result, Addisonio populations in Louisiana experienced high levels of illiteracy and a lack of formal education. They were unable to record their language in any written form and instead adhered to the ancient tradition of oral history. What we can tell, however, is that the region's new dominant language, English, began to influence even the isolated Isleños. Just like Addisonio's treatment of Louisiana French, English words were restricted to allow for easier pronunciation. Terms such as whiskey favored Spanish vowels over English ones, using E instead of I, whiskey instead of whiskey. Another interesting phenomenon occurs in the term atrás. Typically in Spanish, if you want someone to return something, such as a call, you use the verb devolver. But in English, we simply tell people to do something back to us, like call me back. This structure doesn't exist in Spanish varieties, most of them, but it developed in Addisonio, mirroring an English structure using Spanish words. The isolation period of the Addisonios had both positive and negative impacts on the community, but regardless, it faded away in the 1900s. A combination of factors opened up Sabine Parish to outside influences in the larger Anglophone American world. Out of all the indigenous populations in Louisiana, the Addisonios of Sabine Parish saw the earliest introduction of formal education. In 1904, the first school became accessible to the children of the Ibar community. Sabine Parish schools were taught entirely in English and operated by teachers, usually from outside the community. One parochial school in the area even had Irish nuns running it. A sense of shame became prevalent among Addisonio speakers as they started to associate their own dialect with a lack of education and a form of cultural backwardness, and associated English with being educated and part of a larger American society. As the years wore on, subsequent generations of parents felt pressure to encourage English over Addisonio. One older man that I spoke with in Zwolle told me that his grandparents spoke Addisonio fluently, but considered their Spanish language to be, quote, a disgrace, end quote. When I asked him why, he told me that his grandparents hadn't received formal education, and they felt ashamed at their lack of literacy. Outside influence made physical pathways into Sabine Parish as well. Kansas City Southern laid railroad tracks deep into Sabine, opening the way for a thriving logging industry. Sawmills began to pop up, and Addisonio started to work at them. A new trade replaced the more traditional occupations of hunting and farming. One interesting consequence of the logging industry's arrival was the use of something called sawmill sign. Sawmills are incredibly loud places, and as such, workers need a form of communication that doesn't involve speaking. Sawmill sign involves a set of limited gestures that allow individuals to communicate with one another across long distances. This action was given the A limited set of gestures and hand signals came into use, such as pulling one's thumb across the abdomen to indicate the end of a workday. This action was given the Mobilian phrase tabohi reja, literally meaning cuts belly, and members of the community used it outside the sawmills to indicate that something was finished or that the day was done. Other industries also came into Sabine Parish. In 1928, oil was discovered. Between 1929 and 1933, around 437 wells were drilled across the parish. The largest and most profitable well was south of the village of Zwolle, and English-speaking workers moved into the area to work at these new sites. Here we see three men working in a laboratory at the Zwolle Field in the 1930s, sporting their white lab coats. By 1934, the Zwolle Field alone had 623 wells, with about 226 actually being productive. Locals adapted to the changing landscape in several ways. Some, like Paul Ebarb here, posted by his bananas, opened stores that served both the local community and English-speaking newcomers. Economic and social incentives to speak English and adhere to a larger Anglophone society put pressure on Addisonyo speakers, compounding the desire to break from the language. What we are seeing is an example of another language supplanting domains once held by Addisonyo. Domains are more or less theoretical categories where language serves a specific function. For example, Addisonyo was never used in the domain of formal education. That was always an English-dominated space. As the influence of English grew and the prestige of Addisonyo fell, more and more domains fell under the use of English. Commerce now occurred among English speakers as well as the local population, meaning that English took precedence for use in commercial activity. The domain of law was likewise English-dominated, and eventually Addisonyo was limited to use in the domain of the household. Speakers reported in the 1980s talk about farm work, housework, and regular activities of life that don't extend beyond that particular domain. This use of Addisonyo as a means to convey gossip or otherwise secret information also served to limit the dialect's usage and inhibit its passage to younger generations. As Addisonyo was falling out of use in its own community, another massive change occurred in Sabine Parish. In 1955, authorities from the states of Texas and Louisiana began to plan for the creation of a massive body of water. The Sabine River, on whose banks and surrounding lands generations of Addisonyos had lived, was set to be flooded for the creation of a reservoir. Work on Toledo Bend Reservoir began in 1964 and finished in 1969, engulfing 185,000 acres of land. For reference, that's about 21 Cross Lakes. Let that sink in. The waters consumed a number of small settlements near the rivers, and officials relocated over 1,000 graves prior to flooding the area. The creation of Toledo Bend displaced several families in the area, including Addisonyo speakers. Some families whose land went under opted to move to more metropolitan areas, such as our own Shreveport or Houston, and left the communities behind. Others consolidated in towns that now found themselves at the water's edge, such as Noble, Ebarb, and Zwolle. This geographic shift of families is associated with boosting local identity, particularly centering around indigeneity. The American Indian Civil Rights Movement began in the late 1960s and gained momentum across the nation, encouraging the multi-ethnic populations in Sabine Parish to take pride in their indigenous heritage. The Choctaw Apache tribe of Ebarb was founded in 1977 and received state recognition in 1978, making them the second largest tribe in the entirety of Louisiana. Tribal members have been advocating for their rights and preserving their culture ever since. Beginning in the 1960s, researchers also took an interest in recording the remnants of the Addisonyo dialect. Interviews were conducted as early as 1961, but many were not recorded. The 1980s saw linguistic researchers such as Dr. Louisa Stark and Dr. John M. Lipsky recording elders as they spoke Addisonyo. Community members such as Ms. Betty Rivers also conducted interviews with local adults in English, showing community impressions of Addisonyo. The last fieldwork conducted with the Addisonyo speakers occurred in 1998 by Dr. Comfort Pratt, and no fluent speakers have been located since. In a 1983 interview with Ms. Betty Rivers, Ms. Sepulvedo remembered being raised with Spanish spoken in the household. With regards to her current fluency, she said, quote, "We'll see. As far as Spanish, I can understand anything, but I cannot talk it," end quote. A lack of language usage over the years meant that Ms. Sepulvedo couldn't utilize Addisonyo, even though she and close family members once spoke it fluently. Many community members from Sabine Parish, including members of the Choctaw Apache tribe, told me how they lamented the loss of Addisonyo. In 1 week, I spoke to an elderly woman in her 80s and later to a college-age woman whose ancestors once used Addisonyo. Both wished that the dialect had been passed down to them. and both regarded its loss as an absolute tragedy. As discussed at the beginning of this presentation, Adecenyo is currently dormant. Bits and pieces of the dialect appear from time to time in conversation, but the use of the dialect on a daily basis is no more. It's easy for us to sit back and say, well, that's just the course of time. There's nothing we can do. But the beautiful thing about language is that it's always changing and adapting. Even so-called dead languages like Hebrew and Manx have been revived and see fluent speakers today. Adecenyo is more than just a language. It's a mark of local identity and a testament to the tenacity of a multi-ethnic population in Northwest Louisiana. The desire of modern descendants to have access to their ancestors' language shows how, with the proper resources and time, Adecenyo could become a common sound once more in Louisiana borderlands. The Choctaw Apache people in particular have a large cultural stake in Adecenyo, and independent organizations such as the Hominti Society are currently working to reintroduce other languages to the area, such as Mobilian trade jargon. Cooperation and interest from both of these groups suggest that Adecenyo may have a chance at returning to its rightful place as Northwest Louisiana's one and only native dialect of Spanish. And with that, Tabohi Reja, we are done. Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments? Yes.
Oh, yeah, so I have two kind of interrelated questions. One is, at the height of Adecenyo population, do you have a sense of what the numbers might be in Louisiana?
Not particularly, because the Adecenyos were largely not literate for the majority of their history. We don't have a very good track record of who did and who didn't speak the dialect. We could go based off of census numbers for the area, which populations were rather low. I don't have a specific number on me, but generally speaking, we don't know the exact number of speakers at its height.
My second question,
Yes.
which is also probably a possible question, I'm just curious, like, I was wondering, people who do this work and study this kind of content, is there like a breaking point in which language becomes precarious? Like you were talking about dormant versus endangered, in some of the language you had. In terms of like a population size, it's hard to answer this because again, we're thinking of don't know the size of the population. But this phenomenon that happened here happened elsewhere. Do you have a sense of, do people model this and map it in terms of when to see how quickly the language could vanish? Is this happening within like a generation, 3 generations?
Yes. So they absolutely do, and Dr. Pollock probably knows a lot more about this than I. But the phenomenon is called language loss or language death, right? Which is a very scary term. But it refers to, of course, the sudden decrease in the use of a language usually related to more dominant outside languages like English in our modern culture. And there are different models that you can study it with. It really depends on what angle that you're going for. But with Adecenyo, we did see the loss of the language in about one generation that kind of more or less correlated to the introduction of combination of things, education, industry, and more opening to the outside world, right? So we did see a single generation just go from being fluent in Adecenyo to, nope, you speak English now.
So literacy was to zero. There was nobody reading and writing this language.
So in the language, no, we have absolutely no documents or records whatsoever.
Nobody gets educated enough to
Not in
wanted
Adecenyo.
to record what they were thinking and what was going on.
So the only thing that we would have that would be close to an example of written Adecenyo would be from the colonial authorities that were stationed at Los Ideas and their sort of archaic dialect of Spanish, but that doesn't reflect the sort of Spanish we're seeing in the 1830s, the 1840s, that area. In that time period, because of the isolation of the community, there was virtually no education whatsoever. I've not found a single document, and most people who I speak with say that my grandparents and all of their people before them, they never knew how to read and write. I was in Zwolle this past Friday, and I was talking back and forth with this older gentleman, and he told me how he has this piece of paper that's pinned to his wall, and it has the name Lucy written on it. This was the only thing that his grandmother remembered and was able to write, but she couldn't write anything else.
So we just stuck with whatever got recorded
Yeah, so we,
by the people who were literate.
yeah, so unless somebody somewhere finds something in their attic and we can examine it, For the time being, the only thing we have are these recordings from starting more or less in the 1980s. There were a few, not really recordings, but interviews that occurred in 1961 and beyond. That was with Dr. Hiram F. Gregory and Dr. George Armstead. Samuel Armstead, my bad. Samuel Armstead. They conducted those, but it was in person and they just took